works of Sayyid Nursi. And that's how we really began to be introduced to. My general views of the Hizmet movement is that it is one of the leading ideas will filter. My name is Azam Nizamuddin. I am an attorney in Chicago, an activist, and I also teach religious studies at Loyola University of Chicago. I first met members of the Hizmet movement in the late 1990s when I attended a panel discussion about the interactions between religion and science. And I was really struck by the sophisticated understanding and appreciation of science from a religious perspective, in particular, a Muslim religious perspective. And I remember meeting Dr. Zaki at that time and listening to his keynote address about that concept. And I was quite impressed with their level of understanding and appreciation and the whole notion of engaging religion and science. And I thought that was very intriguing to me at that time. My general views of the Hizmet movement is that it is one of the leading, I would say, Islamic movements in the world today. And it's also one of the leading global spiritual and social movements in the world because of its impact not only within Turkey, but also in various Muslim countries in Central Asia, and now today in North America as well. My views about Fethullah Gulen are that I believe he is one of the leading Islamic thinkers in the world. But more importantly, I think he's also an important global figure, particularly in today's sort of divide between the East and the West. He's somebody who tries to transcend the divisions that have been artificially constructed by either political players, religious players, and other social economic factors. And he tries to bridge the gap between human beings so that they can not only really present the best possible light of a human being, the notion of insan al-kamil, the perfect human being, so you develop yourself spiritually, but his really push towards development of education, particularly in underdeveloped communities, is really important today to fight not only poverty but ignorance. And as you know, ignorance leads to misunderstandings, leads to poverty, and leads to hate. And his push towards a better educated society, I think, is really very, very significant. I think that the Gulen or Hizmet movement represents Islam by, on the one hand, maintaining a strong connection to and being rooted in the Islamic primary sources, such as the Quran and the prophetic teachings, but at the same time not sort of neglecting the world around it. So there are unfortunately many other movements around the globe, Muslim movements around the globe, which sort of have decided that they don't want to have anything to do with the West, they don't want to have anything to do with modernity, or in some instances reject modernity and the West. And I think that Fethullah Gulen promotes Islamic values, Islamic teachings, without necessarily rejecting the world and rejecting the West. And I think that's a very important, and it's really an innovative development of the past 100 years of Islamic thinkers. I think my view about Hizmet and other organizations involved in interfaith and interreligious dialogue is one that is a very necessary engagement in today's reality. We are no longer living in the Darul Islam versus the Darul Harb dichotomy anymore. I mean, some people may still think we are, but generally we are not. There are Muslims in almost every single country. Many of them are as minorities, religious minorities, like in Australia or in sub-Saharan Africa, and of course in Europe and North America. On the other hand, you have Christian and Jewish communities in the Muslim world, in the Middle East, in South Asia, in North Africa, and in Indonesia and Malaysia, for example. And in those scenarios, you have to be able to have positive engagement with other religious communities. In fact, we know from our own tradition that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had engaged with religious minorities. In fact, we know that the Christians of Najran, for example, visited him at the mosque and stayed in the masjid and prayed in the masjid in Medina. And they had positive interaction, they disputed, they argued, but nevertheless, after 3 days, they departed on positive relations and left. That to me is the prophetic model that Fethullah Gulen and the Hizmet movement also want to follow, which is positive engagement. Secondly, I think it's important to understand for Muslims that religion, despite what certain people have argued in Europe, has not gone away. In particular, in the United States, religion plays a central role. So even, for example, when legislatures at the state and federal level begin any opening session, they begin with prayer. Whenever a terrible incident, a tragedy occurs, religious notables will appear at ceremonies immediately to bless or to offer prayers. Muslims need to be at those events, and they need to be front and center to show that they're also involved. So if you are not engaged with your fellow Catholics, your fellow Protestants, with your fellow Jews and others, then you're going to be isolated, and ultimately you're going to be ignored. And Islam has never been a religion that was ignored and that did not participate in the world, and particularly in the events of the world. And I think Fethullah Gulen and the Hizmet movement understand that, and that's why they're willing to take those risks, because in some instances it involves risks. But to do that, you have to be positive, and you have to have confidence in your capabilities and in your knowledge of your religion. And I think that's what Fethullah Gulen provides. What I think about the development of the schools and the educational program of Hizmet is that it is really, I think, an integral part of not only the movement itself, but also in terms of how a religious movement can be successful. In other words, many Islamic movements make the mistake by trying to work from the top down. They think by attaining political authority that somehow their ideas will filter to the bottom, almost in a trickle-down effect. But that really has not been a very successful program. It has never worked in any society. We can see that in Pakistan, we can see that in Egypt. But rather, if you have a program where people are educated from the roots, from the ground level, you can inspire and educate those people then to develop into significant players in the world scene, particularly as teachers, as educators, as journalists, and other professionals. And that, I think, has been a strength of the Hizmet movement. And secondly, I think that the Hizmet movement draws its inspiration and teaching from Said Nursi, who in the early 20th century argued that religion and science are compatible, that the science that the West has promoted since the late 17th and 18th century, particularly post-Enlightenment, has permitted people to develop, but at the expense of faith and morality. And I think Said Nursi argued that you can have faith, morality, and science together. And I think the Hizmet movement, and in particular Fethullah Gulen, draws from those teachings and has then engaged in a very positive aspects in promoting education, so that he promotes these schools which produce students who excel in math, who excel in science, and who even will excel in other subjects, particularly in social sciences and humanities. And therefore, this educational project, as envisioned by Fethullah Gulen's teaching and as reflected in these schools, promotes a positive development within those respective communities, but also on a more global scale. The charitable work and efforts of the Hizmet movement are a very important component of Fethullah Gulen's teachings. It's inspired, of course, from the prophetic teaching and the Quranic instruction to provide people with charitable giving, not only in terms of what we normally refer to as zakat, but also in terms of sadaqah, which is general charitable giving. And this is an essential pillar of Islamic ethics and Islamic social discourse, which is you not only help those in need, but help those who ask, help your relatives, help your next of kin, help orphans, etc. And I think he is continuing that legacy within the Islamic tradition, but also on a need basis today with so much poverty in places like Somalia and Afghanistan and Iraq, where when many NGOs left, the Hizmet movement went into dangerous places such as Somalia to provide support to individuals and communities who have been really hurt by the war that has been engaging for a couple of decades. My thoughts about the conflict with respect to the recent tensions in Turkey and the scandal, the corruption scandal with the AKP movement and party, as well as the sort of allegation that the Hizmet movement has sort of been trying to undermine the AKP, are simply that I think this conflict to me demonstrated the consistency and the credibility of the Hizmet movement in the sense of it is not interested in attaining power, it is not interested in political power in Turkey or elsewhere in the world, but it wants to adhere to a certain pro-democratic, pro-liberty and freedom agenda, so that those who are elected to political power not only have a responsibility to provide economic development and to provide education to their people, but at the same time are held to the highest ethical standards of conduct. And I think the Hizmet movement has been consistently asking for that without necessarily asking for anything in return as a quid pro in terms of being quiet and then attaining power. And I think that's a positive reflection upon the Hizmet movement.